Bonjour tout le monde, and welcome to my weekly podcast, which I can now say is up to over 20 regular listeners probably, because that's how many subscribers I have now. As you can no doubt tell by the title and thumbnail, I'm on a bit of a Zelda kick at the moment, at least up through next weekend when I hope to be able to review Skyward Sword HD for you guys. But that's for later. This week will be one part companion piece for one of my guides, and one part moderately hot take on the relative quality of 3D Zeldas to continue with a thread from last week. Going back to that first one though, a few days ago I released my organizational notes for 100% completion of Skyward Sword over on my Patreon, making it the third such guide I have uploaded there. As usual, I'm not entirely certain if anyone finds those kinds of spreadsheet projects helpful, but as a completionist I get a kick out of making them and hope that my patrons can get some use out of them, especially if they're planning to pick up Skyward Sword next week. If there are any changes to the 100% process in the HD version, I'll of course make updates, but from all the trailers we've seen, it doesn't seem like there will be. I'm kind of torn over major content additions and remakes personally. On the one hand, it's obviously something to entice players of the originals and justify the price tag, but on the other, it does mess with the sense of familiarity and the whole process of experiencing an old game again, which are some of the biggest reasons people are drawn to remakes in the first place. Nintendo does love remaking their stuff, so I could pull a lot of examples here purely from personal experience, but I'm going to wait until I get my hands on Skyward Sword HD to make a judgment in this case. Now, for anyone who likes Zelda and who might be interested in getting into 100% completion, but who's never really considered gaming from that angle, I will say that Skyward Sword makes for a fantastic place to start. Everything's laid out very neatly, there's just enough optional content where it'll give you plenty to do without feeling overwhelming, and the world layout makes backtracking less of a chore than it can be in some games, and that's not even taking into account the new Amiibo fast travel feature. Additionally, when it comes to Zelda, I find that one of the biggest factors in how easy a game is to 100% is, oddly enough, its minigame selection, because in this series they range from so trivial you don't even need to think about them, to frustrating to the point of madness because they rely too heavily on either luck or ridiculous levels of skill. There's a reason that I don't consider the giant Kuko and A Link Between Worlds necessary for that game's 100%, just put it that way. As for Skyward Sword, it's in a bit of an odd place on that point, because the majority of its annoying minigames have earned their reputation solely because of their poor use of motion controls. If the HD version succeeds in giving us more responsive analog and button-based alternatives, I may have to reconsider my position on events like the inappropriately named Fun Island and the rickety coaster. And without those frustrations, 100%ing the game should be fully manageable, even for newer players. But, I doubt many of you clicked on this video hoping to hear me ramble about one of my 100% guides. So let's shift gears and talk about how I think this game compares to Breath of the Wild on that score. Full disclosure, I have finished Breath of the Wild 100%, DLC included, but I did that shortly after release, so we're talking around 4 years ago now. Since that time, I've never been able to pick up the game again. I've tried, but pretty much as soon as I finish with the Great Plateau, I just get overwhelmed with the number of options for places you can go and things you can do, and stop. It doesn't help either that I'm far from a top-end gamer on the skill level, and Breath of the Wild has some brutal skill checks, probably more so than any other game in the series. I'm not even touching Master Mode, the base game has enough of that going on for me. And even leaving that aside, there's just so little structure to the game that it feels impossible to approach like any other Zelda game. And I realize that for many people that's actually a selling point, that Breath of the Wild is so free-form and is more about making your own kind of adventure, whether that's doing something hardcore or silly or even just stumbling your way slowly through the world enjoying its vastness and the thrill of discovery. I get all those things, I really do. It's just that whenever I try to boot up the game again, there's always this loop running in the back of my mind. 120 shrines, 900 Korok seeds, dozens of armor sets. And in the 4 years since it's come out, I've yet to stumble across any kind of guide for neatly organizing all that doesn't also assume that the player has speedrunner levels of skill. Even the original Legend of Zelda on the NES has some level of coherent structure, even if that's mostly because that game is tiny. You know how Breath of the Wild's story frequently draws criticism for, well, barely existing unless you seek it out, and even then it's kind of insubstantial? It's like that, but for gameplay. Like I said last week, I do think this is predominantly a matter of personal taste. That's why create your own content kinds of games like Mario Maker and Animal Crossing never appealed to me. but at the same time, Breath of the Wild still has enough elements of the typical Zelda experience that it can't quite shake the feeling that the overall game would have been a little better if it had had some rails. That's mostly what I'm worried about with its sequel, that we get another huge, unfocused, open-world adventure that does amazing from a commercial perspective, but also disappoints in all the same ways that the first Breath of the Wild did. Whether that's the underwhelming dungeon design, or the piecemeal story, or the nagging feeling that no, more is not always better. I realize that given the size of my subscriber base here, I don't tend to get many comments on my videos, but I'd be interested to hear from any fans of open-world adventure games or RPGs how they feel about the subject of 100% completion, because I feel like they'd probably have a better perspective on how that mindset works in games like Breath of the Wild than someone like me coming almost entirely from more traditional Zelda and other action-adventure series. I did have the thought recently that I could do an entire video essay on how the completionist mentality works in a general sense, going through the process of breaking down games and organizing material in an efficient way. I would have to check to make sure the YouTuber who actually calls himself the completionist hasn't already done something like that, though. It would kind of surprise me if he hadn't at some point. I believe that's going to do it for me this week, however. Thanks for listening, and thanks especially to my patrons. You can follow the Patreon link in the description if you'd like to become a patron and get access to all the guides and other bonus content I've uploaded over there. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy my podcast and videos. Next weekend, you can expect a breakdown of Skyward Sword HD, as I discuss how the new controls hold up, as well as any other little changes I spot during my first few days with the game. Au revoir.